Hello and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. You're listening to the music of today's guest, Samuel Adams. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On season 4 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 29th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 16th to 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today, I'm joined by Samuel Adams. Adams is an American composer whose music blends acoustic and digital sounds in inventive ways. He has been commissioned by a number of major ensembles, including the San Francisco Symphony, Los Angeles Philharmonic, and Chicago Symphony, and has collaborated with many of today's leading artists such as conductors Esa-Pekka Salonen and Michael Tilson Thomas, and pianists Connor Hannock, Emmanuel Axe, and Sarah Cahill. His album, Current, was released on Other Minds Records in 2023. A Bay Area native, born in San Francisco and raised in Berkeley, Adams today lives in Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be here.
So to start off, I wanted to ask you, since you're from the Bay Area, what the effect of growing up here had on your musical development?
Well, I think the Bay Area is a fabulous place to be a young musician. I mean, I think primarily it's about the educational institutions that we have, particularly in the East Bay, where I grew up. I grew up in Berkeley. Places like the Crowden School, which when I was a student there was a couple dozen kids working together in the basement of a church. It's changed quite a bit, but it remains a really important, educational sort of nexus for young aspiring classical musicians. And then we also have places like the Jazz School, which also, when I started taking classes there, it was like two small rooms above, I think it was La Note, French restaurant on Shattuck Avenue, and has turned into, well, it's gone through many different iterations of growth, but now is a fully accredited university where you can go and get an actual degree in jazz performance. So I could talk about the various influences of being a Californian, but I would say first and foremost, I think the most prominent influences really just came from the places that I studied as a kid.
And what was your instrument?
I started off playing piano. I studied with a woman named Jean Ishimaru, and it was like hardcore Suzuki method, like Clementi and, Schumann, Album for the Young, and very sort of European classical music focused. And then I picked up the bass when I was, how old was I? I must have been 9 or 10 years old. And I studied with Michelle Burr, who passed away not too long ago. She was the principal bassist of the Philharmonic Baroque Orchestra. Fabulous player. She was also an electric player, although I never formally studied electric with her. And she was married to Michael Burr, who was the principal bass player of the San Francisco Symphony. So it was all sort of like tight-knit community of musicians in the Bay Area. Yeah, and then when I was, 12 or 13, I became really interested in improvised music and jazz, and sort of drifted away from the classical sphere and became more interested really in improvising and taking gigs on Craigslist for $50 and like Aptos or whatever, and playing with random people. And in a way, that was sort of like one of the most important musical educations that I had as a young person, was just like going to random corners of the Bay Area and learning the Great American Songbook at like Vietnamese restaurants as a gigging player.
Has improvisation remained a part of your either musical practice or how you compose?
Yeah, definitely. I remained an active bass player until I left New York City, which was like 2014. And a lot of the music that I was playing in New York sort of straddled the line between composition and improvisation. I played quite a bit with a composer performer named Andy Akiho, whose music, or I should say a large part of his body of work has sort of like space for improvisation built in. And we worked together quite a while playing his music. I wrote some music for his group as well. So that was a big part of my identity, like post-graduate school, living in New York City. But I don't perform as an improviser. Well, I don't perform really at all anymore. I'm too busy in my studio writing by myself. However, the process of composition for me definitely, I would say, is heavily influenced by my experiences as an improviser. In fact, like notation is the very last thing that I do in the process. I'll spend a lot of time just recording myself improvising, transcribing those improvisations and like playing along with them, sort of how Bill Evans used to do with some of his recordings. And yeah, a lot of the germinal impulses from my pieces, even when they end up in their final form as formally wrought things that have very clear architectures, yeah, the impulses always come from improvisation and from my experiences as an improviser.
Local listeners might remember your piece No Such Spring, which was performed by the San Francisco Symphony and pianist Connor Hannock in 2023. And I know you have a long history of working with the San Francisco Symphony, but also with orchestras in general. So could you talk about how your approach to writing for either this orchestra or the orchestra in general has changed since the last time you worked with them?
Yeah, I mean, writing music for your close friends is a really easy and fun thing to do because you know them, they know you. You can put music on the page and you don't really have to micromanage how they might interpret your gestures. That's why working with like Connor Hannock, for example, the pianist, or the violinist Karen Gomio, or Andy and Travis, the Living Earth show, why these relationships are so meaningful and so fruitful is because we've established a sort of collaborative language over a very long period of time. And you can't say the same always about an orchestra. You know, sometimes when you have, a performance for the first time with an orchestra, you literally don't know a single one of the, 80 or 90 people on stage. And there's definitely the possibility that if like, a critical mass of them sort of make a judgment about you right at the beginning of the process, you're toast, you're persona non grata. But I would say this isn't the case for the San Francisco Symphony. I'm friends with a lot of the players in the orchestra. I've worked with them on, like 3 or 4 pieces. I've curated for their experimental late night series called Soundbox. And yeah, I mean, of course, when you're writing for an orchestra, you have a limited amount of time. You have to be very clear with your notation. You just, like, there's no room to sit down and like pontificate about what this accent might mean and exactly how on the string the viola should play. There's just really no time for that. So you have to be very clear. That being said, I feel like I know them so deeply and I know what repertoire they play really well and like what sort of makes them tick. And a lot of this goes back to MTT, Michael Tilson Thomas, and the work that he did with them for 25 years before he finished his tenure a couple of years ago. So with this piece, No Such Spring, that I wrote, I started during the pandemic, and which was premiered in February of 2023. I really thought about the specific sort of like angles in their repertoire that really define their unique identity. So I thought a lot about Stravinsky. I thought a lot about Ives. I thought a lot about Copland, actually, which is not really a composer that I really cared too much about. But somehow during the pandemic, I just became really drawn to his music and sort of to like what he stood for as a public figure during the war in the middle of the century, 20th century. And yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that the piece sort of worked with them. I think a lot of the gestures, they just knew how to communicate because of their expertise with said repertoire. But also it was just an easy process because I know, more than 70% of the players. My wife, Helen Kim, used to play with the San Francisco Symphony. She was the associate principal second violinist for 5 or 6 years before we left for Seattle, Washington. So I would say much more than other orchestral collaborations, that really felt like making music with friends.
You mentioned your close collaborative relationship with Connor Hannock, who will be performing your etudes on night 2 of the Other Minds Festival. Is this a collection of etudes in the traditional sense, or it's focusing on developing different technical skills?
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, like I think an etude at its best can provide a platform for an instrumentalist to explore something technical while also being, like musically interesting. It's why we hear a lot of Chopin in concert and not a lot of Hanon, because one does both very well and one is like purely for didactic purposes. So my hope with these is that, it's part of the Chopin camp. I wrote these pieces for Connor's students, actually, at the Music Academy of the West in Santa Barbara, where Connor has been the head of the solo piano studies for, I want to say, maybe a dozen years or so. You might have to fact check me on that. And for the last couple of years, they've been commissioning a composer to write short pieces for their solo piano students. Well, I should say that I'm really bad at writing 2 or 3 minute pieces. I find them so difficult, and composers actually get asked very often to do sort of short pieces, which, end up becoming like a part of a much larger curatorial project. And some composers just have the easiest time writing those pieces. I find them very, very difficult. It's something about the canvas of 2 or 3 minutes, which sort of scares me. I mean, it could be that my music is sort of defined by how things evolve over time and how you sort of need a little bit of space for the ideas to ferment. And that just doesn't happen with 2 or 3 minutes. So I thought of rather than writing 6 miniatures, that I would actually create one piece that was divided into, the etudes are divided into 7 parts. So the first and the last etude are effectively this. There's like a small little difference between them. So it's really like 6 pieces. And they form a musical architecture, which I think might be sort of my most like formally clear, I guess, like formal conceit that I've ever created as a composer. There's like a broken sort of symmetry. So the piece unfolds, it's like A, B, C, and then there's a sort of keystone of an arch, and then the last 3 etudes sort of mirror the first 3 in sort of subtly different ways. And since the premiere a couple of years ago, Connor has been really brilliantly playing these pieces. And we actually recorded the set of etudes last August, and we are going to release those as part of a record with some other piano music that I've written over the last decade. And I'm really excited about that. Connor's just a really wonderful pianist, and he sort of has a very broad aesthetic sensibility, which I think might be indicative of my generation and our attitude towards like style, which is to say that my sort of compositional coming of age was in 2010, 11, 12. And by that period, the sort of bifurcation between minimalism and serialism and postmodern or whatever, it had all kind of dissolved. So for me, in my music, I'm always drawing from everything, like Lamont Young means just as much as like Boulez does to me. And what I love about Connor is he plays all of that music with the same kind of intensity and intellectual curiosity. He can totally do everything. He plays Milton Babbitt, but he also plays Hans Otte's Book of Das Buch der Klang. And I think that's why I just really feel like he's like his priorities as an artist are aligned with mine, and it's really easy to work with him. And he's a great dude as well.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Etudes by Samuel Adams, performed by pianist Connor Hannock.
So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing him give this performance in San Francisco, and he'll also be playing a piece with Helen Kim, who's my wife, a wonderful violinist. I don't think they've never played this piece together, so that'll be a first. So that's really exciting too.
And that piece is Violin Diptych.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
How are you thinking about the relationship between your music and the existing violin repertoire in that piece?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the honest answer is that I just really wasn't. I mean, the piece, let's see, this might be the only piece of music that I've written not as part of a commission in the last, I don't know, decade and a half or something. And it sort of was birthed out of the crucible of boredom. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, I had orchestral commissions to work on, but it just seemed sort of silly to write orchestral. It just seemed like inappropriate more than anything, particularly because, I had performer friends who were just sitting around sort of twiddling their thumbs, trying to find ways to avoid having to make like a Brady Bunch style COVID online video. And I had never formally written music for Helen up to that point. She'd played a couple of my pieces, including a chamber violin concerto several times, but I'd never actually written music for her. And so I wrote the first movement, which is called Playing Changes. It's about 6 minutes long. And this is like very early pandemic. This is maybe May 2020. So sort of right at the height of unknowing. And I mean, I suppose because the piece came out of personal necessity and it was so immediate, and it was something that I had to do. I don't know. I seem to not really be concerned with the intellectual apparatus of like where to place it in conversation with other violin music. And in a way, it's sort of like maybe my most kind of like freely expressive music that I've ever written. And yeah, the second movement, Changes Move, came out of another request from another violinist, Joe Puglia, who's a wonderful American violinist who's been living in the Netherlands for, I don't know, a decade or so, and who's recently taken up the role as artistic director of the Asco Schoenberg Ensemble. And so I wrote another movement to the piece, but included piano, and it just ended up being a totally like odd bird of a piece. The first movement doesn't have piano, and then the second movement does, and like there are a bunch of different versions of the piece, and the piece also became sort of the germinal impulse for a multimedia project that I was involved in the following year in 2021 with a ballet company based in San Francisco called Post Ballet. And they are dancers, and Helen and a really wonderful cinematographer named Ben Tarquin, who I went to, like, we go way back to our teenage years. So yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I wasn't really thinking that way. I was just thinking about making music with someone who was very close to me. And it ended up being this, I don't know, it ended up being this piece that I never would have created if someone had asked for it, And I don't just mean the form of the music. I mean like the sort of emotional expression of the music and how it feels like, I don't know, something about the two movements feels very like unsettled. Like there's a lack of balance in the piece, which I think is okay. It was early COVID at the end of the day. And yeah, I mean, with a little bit of time and distance and perspective now, I can see sort of intuitively that obviously what I was thinking about the most was Bach, particularly with the first movement. I mean, it could have been that Helen was playing a lot of Bach because she was bored at the beginning of the pandemic. So it was just like what I was hearing in my living room. But yeah, I don't think that I wasn't really sort of conscientiously in conversation with the violin rep when I was writing it.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Samuel Adams' Violin Diptych, performed by violinist Karen Gomio and pianist Connor Hannock, and released by Other Minds Records. Could you talk also about how you're using the electronics in this piece? It's quite subtle.
Yeah, it's how I use electronics in several pieces actually. It's a technique that I developed. Well, I didn't develop it, but it's a technique that I explored with a work from 2014 called Shade Studies, which I wrote for Sarah Cahill, a wonderful pianist and icon of Bay Area contemporary music. And it's basically a way to artificially elongate the resonance of a piano using sine tones, which are, the purest form of digital sound. It's just a sine wave. So effectively, the resonance of a piano, once the hammers have attacked the strings and the sustain pedal is letting the metal strings of the piano vibrate, that's more or less, the acoustic equivalent of a sine tone. And with Shade Studies, basically what I'm doing is giving the sense of the resonance of the piano continuing ad infinitum by hiding a little loudspeaker in the resonating body of the piano and having Sarah press an iPad to trigger very, very subtle sine tone samples. And it worked really well. It's the kind of thing, if you overdo it, it sort of takes away from the mystery of what's going on technically. And it's something that I explored in the second movement of the diptych. The second movement is called Changes Move. So you'll hear a lot of these very subtle gestures from the piano, sort of elongated to give the sensation that the piano's like floating in an imagined space with infinite reverb or something. It gives the music a kind of like mirage-like quality, to me at least. And it's something that I'm actually putting in my new piece for Sarah, which will be premiered on this concert with the diptych and the etudes.
That idea of using the resonance of the piano reminded me of something that I saw you say in another interview about Sundial, which is also going to be performed at the festival, of the percussion acting as a resonator for the string quartet and the string quartet acting as a resonator for the percussion. Are you thinking along similar lines there with that piece?
Definitely. I keep asking myself like where this comes from. And I think maybe it has to do with my experience as a kid playing the piano and having my teacher tell me to like stop using the sustain pedal so much. I don't know why. It's just like maybe it was a sort of like insecurity as a kid. Like if I didn't, master the like technique required for a passage in Beethoven or Schubert or something, I would just kind of like put down the sustain pedal. And And then that ended up kind of mesmerizing me as a kid. I remember making these really long, elaborate improvisations with the sustain pedal sort of like always down. And so I guess that somehow translated into a really important aspect of my music making, which is like finding ways for instruments to act as the resonators for other instruments, or using sine waves to do that, or using like snare drums to do that. And yes, for sundial, which is for string quartet, and vibraphone crotalis, which are brass cymbals, really high-pitched brass cymbals, and Almglocken or tuned metal pipes. Yes, the two instrumental groups, the strings and the percussion, are always sort of acting as resonators for one another, and that's kind of the core of what's actually going on in the piece. I mean, there's rhythm and melody and form and all of that, which I think a lot about and is important in the music, but I think fundamentally, like, what I think is communicated or really is sort of like the sensation of resonance and how that changes over time. And it's something that I think is actually really sort of like unexplored territory. You know, like I had a teacher in graduate school who gave a lecture. It was the first lecture that he gave for sort of like a survey of music composition. And he basically made the argument that all music can be boiled down to frequency and amplitude, you know, that pitch is basically just rhythm sped up, and timbre is basically just the complex relationship between frequencies. And yes, like leaving the politics and the social whatever about music aside, I think also there's something to really be said about the spaces in which music is performed and how the spaces can actually have an incredibly profound emotional, they have an emotional impact on the way that we hear. And this is an argument that David Byrne makes in his book. I think it's called On Music or something. Oh, How Music Works. I'm looking at it on my shelf right now. And one of the arguments that he makes is, yeah, I mean, music is made specifically for certain acoustic spaces. You know, that 12th and 13th century Parisian polyphony lacks certain intervals because we're dealing with Notre Dame and a reverberant space of like 12 seconds or something. And, you know, like a Wagner orchestra is really perfectly suited to that sort of size of an opera house. And we could talk about EDM and electronic music and the acoustic space of the headphone, what that means. And, you know, when we think about the architectural spaces that music is communicated, I mean, would you want to hear, I don't know, Tannhäuser in a tiny room? I mean, it would probably, well, actually, maybe that would be interesting. Or would you necessarily want to hear like Ghanaian drumming in Notre Dame? You know, it might not work. It would change the effect of the music, the emotional effect of the music. So this is something that I'm sort of actively exploring by using instruments as sort of like a means to create the sensation of changing spaces and changing sort of like resonant spaces. That's basically how I orchestrate, actually. That's like the guiding principle for me, or at least it has been for the last 5 years or so.
You mentioned that you wrote a new piece for Sarah Cahill that will be premiered at the festival, which is a tribute to the composer Ingram Marshall. What impact did Ingram Marshall have on you and your work?
Well, I knew Ingram first and foremost just as a family friend. He and my father, John, were close buddies in the 70s and 80s in the San Francisco contemporary music community. And I mean, some of my earliest memories as a little kid were hanging out with Ingram and his family. And so that's really how I got to know him before I understood his, place in American musical history as as this really important pioneering composer of electronic and electroacoustic music. But I will say that my first truly meaningful musical experience was hearing an Ingram Marshall piece. I was dragged as a little kid. I probably was like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old or something. I was taken by my father, John, to some black box theater in San Francisco. And the performance was a piece called Alcatraz, which is a multimedia work for solo piano, electronics, delays and a very beautiful collection of photographs by Jim Bankston, who's one of Ingram's old friends and collaborators. And he's probably best known for some of the images that were used by ECM. He made these beautiful sort of dreamlike black and white photographs of Scandinavian fjords. And yeah, Ingram and Jim clearly share many sensibilities in their work. And the images for that performance were all of Alcatraz, which I don't think I'd actually been to as a little kid. And the music unfolded over the course of, I don't know, the piece might be an hour long or something. And it was the first time that I felt inside of a piece of music, if that makes sense. I mean, I'd been listening to music my whole life up until then, but music had always sort of been something something sort of outside of myself that you would listen to and appreciate and analyze. I never felt like that sort of like opiate-like wash of, musical immersion until I heard that piece by Ingram. I mean, I think a lot of it had to do with the setting of the performance. It was dark and, it was amplified, and there was, this visual component which made the experience very immersive. But I also think it had to do with Ingram's, the music itself and the way it was made, and the sort of mesmeric arpeggios that kind of swallow themselves as they unfold. And he played the piano in that performance. And, he wasn't a, first-rate pianist, but he composed the piece with that digital delay technology and all the sort of atmospheric field recordings that were part of the piece, that that was okay. That was kind of part of the aesthetic, that it wasn't this highly wrought, crystalline, like Boulesian piano writing. That was okay. And I mean, in a way, I feel like every piece of mine sort of goes back to this one experience that I had as a little kid, hearing this music that made the subject matter feel both very familiar and like totally Martian at the same time. And I think this is something that I'm trying to do with a lot of my music, to like find that the sort of threshold where the objects that you're encountering on stage are both really familiar and also like new and fresh. I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of going for as a composer. And I think that certainly comes from Ingram and his ability to take like a quotation from Sibelius, or, like a New England church hymn or a field recording from Bosnia, and to transform it into something that's otherworldly that you couldn't possibly imagine existing. Yeah, I really love Ingram's music. I always have, and I was so grateful that Sarah Cahill, who I've known as well since I was a little kid, that she asked for this piece in his honor. So I did the best I could with 8 minutes to honor his music and to honor his legacy. It's interesting with tribute pieces, sort of come to a point where you have to ask yourself, how on the nose and how direct am I going to be? I was asked to write a piece for Terry Riley. This is the piece that I mentioned earlier, Shade Studies.
Let's listen to Sarah Cahill's recording of Shade Studies by Samuel Adams, released by Irritable Hedgehog.
And at the time, it didn't really feel appropriate to sort of include aspects of, well, Terry has a very vast output and he did a million different things aesthetically. But for that tribute, it felt very much that I could still honor him while doing something that was like deeply personal and had nothing to do with sort of like the surface of his music. But with this piece, I mean, it could be the fact that I was very close to Ingram and knew him, that he was a very good friend and a mentor over such a long period of time. But it could also just have to do with the fact that I'm like where I am right now as an artist. But it was very easy to allow his music to show up in the piece. At least, I mean, who knows? The audience might disagree and say it has nothing to do with Ingram. But for me, there are a lot of sort of tropes that to me are very clearly drawn from his output. The most obvious would be the very sort of lontano sound of a foghorn, which emerges about halfway through the piece. It's very quiet. It's not like a heavily amplified thing, like, that sound, like how it shows up in Fog Tropes, which is a really wonderful piece from the mid-'80s. It's also sort of hidden and embedded within the texture of the piano writing, but it's there. And to me, it feels like the most Ingram thing that you could possibly put in a piece is, the sound of a foghorn.
Yeah. And what's the title of the new piece?
I called it Prelude, and it has a subtitle, which is Hammer the Sky Bright. I'm not sure what the title means. It sort of came to me, the image of hammering the sky bright came in a dream. It has to do with the hammers of the piano and the sound of the music in a high register, which hopefully it makes sense in context of hearing the music. But I decided to call it Prelude for a number of reasons. One is that I know how important Debussy's piano music was to Ingram. And I was thinking about particularly the very famous Debussy prelude, the Sunken Cathedral, and how, in a way, sort of every piece by Ingram is a sunken cathedral, like a massive, glorious thing that you can't really see the entirety of. So there was that, and there's something about the piano writing which I think is very influenced from my experiences playing Debussy as a kid. And also just thinking about how Debussy and Ingram sort of belong to a lineage of Impressionism. Ingram called himself an expressivist. I think he was probably joking because, he had a very wry sense of humor, and the idea of sort of typecasting yourself is something that he probably would laugh at. So, he probably was saying that tongue in cheek, but I really think of him as an impressionist more than anything else. And so I also called it a prelude because as I am wont to do with every piece of music, I have to do something that's contrarian. I feel like Ingram's music, his entire body of work is basically just one massive ending. Like all of his pieces feel like postludes. Like everything is an elegy. Everything is like the end of some massive thing. He even has a piece that's called "In My Beginning Is My End." I don't know how self-aware that was, but I've always felt like he's the master of, the elegy. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I should create a piece in his honor that is the beginning of something. And it had me thinking about preludes and obviously there are preludes to operas and preludes to ballets and whatnot, but there's also this tradition of preludes that have no sort of like subsequent thing that happens. Like each Debussy prelude is not followed by something. So it kind of leaves it up to the audience to, sort of like complete the sentence that the music begins. And I like that with this piece in honor of Ingram, that it could be the beginning of something that the listener sort of has to complete on their own.
You can hear the music of Samuel Adams performed by Sarah Cahill, Friction Quartet, Haruka Fuji, Connor Hannock, and Helen Kim at Other Minds Festival 29 on Friday, October 17th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Thank you, Samuel, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 29th festival is October 16th through 19th, 2025 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Join us again next week.